But the main thing I want to talk about this week, I'm sure many of you have seen recently that Canelo Alvarez signed to fight a guy named Avni Yildirim on February 27th, which in some ways is like, oh, cool, Canelo, he fought last month. He's coming back so quickly, staying busy. Nothing wrong with that. The other part of you might be going, why is he fighting this guy? What is the benefit of fighting this particular opponent, particularly when, in the post-fight interview of his last fight, he's saying, unification or bust, basically. And this is definitely not unification or bust. And I want to break down a little bit why he's fighting this guy, because it may not be obvious, but there is a reason that he is fighting Avni Yildirim specifically. When we all would rather probably watch him against Billy Joe Saunders or Caleb Plant or David Benavidez. So, the reality is Canelo has multiple belts at 168, and Avni Yildirim is his WBC mandatory. Now, I've talked a little bit about mandatories on the show before. A mandatory is basically, the belt organization says this is the number one guy. You're now the champion. You have X amount of time to fight this guy. So you might be going, why the fuck is Avni Yildirim Canelo Alvarez's WBC mandatory? If you look down his fucking box rec, the guy hasn't fought since February of 2019. So it'll be just about 2 years since his last fight when he gets in the ring with Canelo Alvarez. So I did my little investigative journalist hat. I put my little investigative journalist hat on, and I figured I'm going to figure out why Avni Yildirim is the mandatory. And this is going to take me a little bit to explain, but basically on February 23rd, 2019, Avni Yildirim lost a close technical decision to, at the time, WBC champion Anthony Dirrell. The cut was to Dirrell. It was caused by a headbutt. That's why they went to the cards, because they had gone past round 4. And at the time, the WBC had mandated a rematch of that fight. While that fight happened, the reason they were fighting for that belt was because David Benavidez had tested positive for cocaine and had been stripped of that belt and no longer had the belt, and the belt had been declared vacant. So basically, while they're negotiating or talking about doing this Avni Yildirim rematch, Benavidez's suspension ends. He becomes an active fighter again, and the WBC says, Benavidez gets a shot at Dirrell first. So Benavidez and Anthony Dirrell fight on September 28th, 2019, and Benavidez stops Dirrell, I believe, in the 9th round. So Benavidez then became the WBC champion again in September 2019. His plan, because Yildirim at the time was his mandatory, was to fight Yildirim soon after. That was his mandatory, but he wound up taking a voluntary defense against Romer Angulo and lost his belt on the scales, right? So he didn't make weight. He got stripped of the belt. So now the WBC is vacant. It's a vacant title, and somehow becomes part of the stakes for the Canelo Alvarez versus Callum Smith fight from this past December. So, all that to be said is that the reason that Canelo Alvarez is fighting Avni Yildirim, and the reason Avni Yildirim is his mandatory, is because Avni Yildirim never got the rematch with Anthony Dirrell, and he never got a title shot against David Benavidez. So there's a couple of questions, right? It's like, why didn't Benavidez fight Yildirim immediately after he beat Dirrell? Why wasn't he forced to take that fight? Why was he given the option to have an optional defense or to pick an opponent? And the answer is that mandatories aren't always mandatory. For whatever reason, if there's a fight that's bigger money, or you have a relationship with the organization, I don't really know entirely how that works. I'm more sort of stating it as a blanket question, like, why is it that mandatories are not always mandatory? Because it's very obvious that they're not. Otherwise, Yildirim would have gotten his shot against Benavidez. Now, you could take that back even farther and be like, how is it that even in 2019, Anthony Dirrell makes sense as a top contender for a belt. That makes sense. He's been a world-class fighter for a long time. But what at the time had Yildirim done to get that shot? Well, regardless of how you feel about that, that was a close fight. And they said that he was going to get that rematch. He was going to get his title shot. So in one sense, this is a ridiculous fight, right? This guy has no chance against Canelo. He's not in the same class of fighter. He was barely in the same class of fighter as Anthony Dirrell, who's definitely not in Canelo's league. And on the other hand, it's long overdue, right? The organization said, you're entitled to this shot. We're going to give you this shot. And it seems like time after time, they found reasons to not force their champion to fight this guy, even though they have him on the hook, like, yo, you're the mandatory for this belt. And a lot of these guys, it's like, how many opportunities do you get to fight for a title? You know what I mean? You only get a handful of opportunities to fight for a title in your career. So, naturally, I think his thought would be, all right, well, they're telling me my shot's coming if I just stay in shape. And that's how fucking 2 years goes by and you don't fight at all. I think there are times where these mandatories get lucky, but there's also times where it forces them to be very inactive, and it feels like the belt organizations are not helping to root out who's actually the best fighter in the division. They're just not. They're not helping that situation because they're each individually their own business. They have their own interests. They want sanctioning fees. And I'm going to do another episode where I talk more extensively about sanctioning fees and what they are. But essentially, when a fighter wins a belt, they have to pay to keep that belt. And so it's in their interest to get new champions, to have vacant belts, to have guys paying sanctioning fees. The challengers have to pay sanctioning fees. So the problem in this situation is that the belt is pretending that it's just fulfilling an obligation. But the reality is they're 2 years fucking late on that obligation. And now it's a mismatch. Now he has absolutely no chance. And this is a terrible fight that, frankly, I don't think anybody cares about. It's just a matter of Canelo keeping his belt so that when he goes to fight Billy Joe Saunders, when he goes to fight Caleb Plant, when he goes to fight David Benavidez, he also has belts to bring to the table.